Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the final session of today's conference, Diversity in Early Careers. Not sure about everyone else, but it's really raining quite hard here, so I hope you didn't get too wet on your lunch breaks. Just before we get to the next session, which is going to be with Nolene Hammond-Jones, just going to quickly remind you about who Sanctuary graduates are, why we put this conference on. So, Sanctuary graduates can reach any student at all UK universities, and everything we do stems from this. Our ability to have email access to every student studying for any degree at any UK university. This gives us the widest possible reach of early careers talent in the UK. We've also synthesized HESA data, which tells us the diversity metrics of every course in the UK. When the two are combined, they allow us to access and engage with target groups of students for our clients. Here is how we reach those students. It's a combination of these four areas. We have our own database of talent. Unique to us, we also have relationships with over 50 universities who allow us to access any of their students on campus. We then have partnerships with a whole range of academic departments across the UK. And finally, we work with over 250 university societies, including the 93% clubs, Women in societies, and Afro-Caribbean societies. We use the right combination of these networks and our data tool to help our clients get the early careers attraction outcomes they desire. We cover the whole early careers ecosystem from the top of the funnel to the nuts and bolts of the recruitment process. We have graduate attraction and brand ambassadors for larger businesses who need help with their attraction. And this particular service can solve quality and diversity of applications, as well as hard to fill roles. We also provide volume screening services as well as end-to-end recruitment. So in terms of how we can help, we offer 3 attraction solutions: bespoke email marketing to your target demographic, in-person events, and on-campus brand ambassadors. All 3 of which are designed to help you get the early careers hiring outcomes you're after, or to solve any challenges that you might have. And here is a brief overview of some of the employers that we work with from a range of industries and a range of different sizes. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter for the final session of the day, Nolene Hammond-Jones. Nolene is working at Lancaster University as part of the business management school there, beg your pardon, and will be providing employers of all shapes and sizes some real solid advice and recommendations around hiring international talent. Again, this session will be packed full of advice that will enable you to go off and make the most of the wide range of international talent in the UK job market. And yeah, it should be a good session. So I'm going to start doing. Hey, Nolene, you okay?
I'm good, thank you.
Good, nice to see you. Thanks for joining.
No problem.
No worries. So yeah, Nolene, I think just maybe let me know that you're okay to share your screen, and then over to you. Yep, I can see. Yeah, I can see it. Yeah. I'll just.
Is it full screen now?
It is now. Yeah, I'll pop myself off camera. If anyone has any questions, please do fire them into the chat throughout. And yeah, have fun, Nolene. See you soon.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Nolene Hammond-Jones. So I'm Deputy Head of the Career Service in the Management School at Lancaster University. And my focus is work-related learning. So I focus on all external stakeholder engagement, placements, projects, everything, essentially, a jack of all trades. But I've been working in international employability for nearly 15 years, and I'm the co-chair of the Outcasts International Task Group as well. I just want to share with you what today's session will cover. So I'll look at some very brief overviews, I promise, because I know it's post-lunch, so everyone's had that post-lunch slump. But how recent policy changes have increased interest in the UK graduate employment among international students. Share some employer perceptions of working with international students and engaging with international students. talk you through why, recruiting international students should be a consideration, as well as sharing with you some of the employability barriers international students experience. I know some of you here as well today will be from the higher education sector and may work in employer engagement teams, so some very short tips about working with graduate employers around international talent. And then also helping you to look at the first steps in developing your international talent and sharing resources with you to engage with this segment of our student and graduate communities in a positive and confident way. So the policy context, just to share with you, these are some of the stories that we have seen in the news over the years. It was a very happy beginning. The UK wanted to increase its international student recruitment. We achieved this quite early, and when the international education strategy was launched, it was, had some great information and recommendations for higher education institutions around supporting international student employability. That moved on to sharing some of resources with employers to help employers and higher education professionals to increase awareness around how you can support these students, what recommendations of support, resources, expertise you should as institutions and as employers use or utilize or embed in your services to help these students in their in positive outcomes from their education. Then after the launch of the graduate route, we know this was a huge change in policy. It was something that in its previous existence was the post-study work visa. I know it still gets referred to as PSW or post-study work visa, but the legal name is graduate route visa. This visa was relaunched, and there was a lot of excitement from higher education institutions around the increase in potential international student numbers. But what we found is that the awareness amongst employers of how to engage with individuals on this route may not have been there. So just to share with you as well, the policy challenges, we are seeing an increasingly hostile political rhetoric, and I'm not going to go into too many details because that's a whole session in itself. But we have seen, unfortunately, government policy being implemented that is disproportionately affecting not just international students, but parents and women in international education, and these changes have made in UK education as one of the top exports that the UK has to offer, that's globally in demand, inaccessible to quite a lot of individuals. So we're seeing this rhetoric rolled out and its impact on the perception of the UK as a destination for international students. And unfortunately, we are in competition with other areas of the world that are looking to not just recruit international students, but longer term planning, looking at how they can upskill the general population and fill those skill shortages, occupation shortages, and upskill in general the larger population through post-study work options. And Australia is, just as an example, has added 2 years to the post-study work visa in order for international students to stay in the Australia for a lot longer. So we're up against international competition for talent. And that means that we've got to think about how we can engage effectively with our international talent within the UK studying. AGCAS, which is the Association for Graduate Careers Advisory Services, which I am a member and I'm on their task group for international, did a study last year, and and I'll share that with you going forward, the results of this study and the research. But essentially the employer perceptions of international graduates wasn't overly positive, and this is some of the feedback that we had from our graduates who decided to go down the graduate route visa and feedback on their perceptions and their experiences. And we have seen that, you know, employers, even though it's a valid right to work route, are refusing to accept the graduate route for a number of reasons. And we do understand that it can be really difficult from an employer perspective to know what the latest legislation is, because it used to update in April and October, but there seems to be updates throughout the year. So we understand that it can feel a difficult or bureaucratic area of recruitment to deal with. But it is upsetting international talent. And as you know, a country, we know, we've seen the news reports on what our international students are worth to the economy, but also to society, our local and regional communities as well. And when we're having feedback from our graduates saying that, you know, not only do they feel that employers are fearful of taking international graduates, but they're also scared of the legislation or the regulations, and therefore exclude or potentially discriminate against these students. And for some institutions, international students make up quite a high proportion of the student community, some over 50%, some nearly 100%, but for many, between 30 and 40% of the student community is international. So we need to look at ways in which we can create equal and equitable opportunities for our students. We talk about, as a society, community, employers and institutions, the importance of EDI. But we also have to understand, what do we mean by EDI? Is EDI something that, as employers or higher education institutions, means it's only valid if you're British? Or does that negate the whole concept of EDI? We talk about diversity in the workplace. Again, is that just British diversity, or is that true diversity in its greater context? So we need to think, as institutions and employers, how we can work together to create these opportunities and make these opportunities accessible for our entire student community, not just for specific cohorts. So in terms of employer perceptions, the biggest barriers, and I've touched on some of these, and this comes through the research and it comes through our employer engagement with employers in the UK, but feedback from employers on recruiting international students does vary dramatically depending on the sector and size of the organisation. We know some employers are put off by the lengthy guidance and confusing language the Home Office produces. Totally accept that. But also employers finding ways or not knowing how to engage with students in a beneficial way who are applying for roles via the graduate route. We also understand that a few employers use certain HR language in job adverts that omit certain areas of the population from applying. So for instance, an employer requiring a UK driving license for a role that doesn't require any driving, or an employer requiring UK experience, knowing that, you know, many international students might not have UK experience. And this can cause upset within the international student community when they're seeing these job adverts on higher education platforms, such as the careers platform, which shares the vacancies. We also understand that employer perceptions and lack of awareness. We know that not all employers have immigration specialists within your organization, and we totally understand that and want to work with you. But also the perceived compliance risks that, you know, what if we make a mistake? What is the impact on the business? We've seen and heard and spoken to many employers using outdated terminology. And a lot of the reason why this is important is because if you're advising students on with using outdated terminology, it can be very confusing for them to know what next steps they need to take in order to increase or maximize their employment potential. So for instance, if you're telling a student they need to get a work permit, for instance, to work in the UK, that isn't a thing. The graduate route is a visa, and you have to be really careful about using the terminology. But if a student goes away looking for a work permit, it can cause delays in their job search, but also a lot of confusion. We have had a number of instances where employers have ghosted applicants when the immigration status has been brought up, including ending interviews early with applicants, and if those interviews are online, terminating the interview when immigration status is brought up, which has massive impact on the individual's confidence, well-being, and also has a broader impact on the university if we partner with the organization. And that brings me to the last point. Employers' attitudes will impact recruitment on higher education sectors. That's why we want to work together with employers to make sure that we're not perpetuating negative rhetoric to our international students, and making sure that we are creating accessible, equitable, and equal opportunities. Working with international students, which I've done for many years, is a really rewarding and interesting opportunity. The students are very highly motivated. The students have cultural and language skills which are in demand from a lot of employers, but many of these students possess specialist skills, especially those at master's level. They may have worked for 2 or 3 years in a specific industry before coming to the UK to do their master's, and that means that employers are benefiting not only from the academic qualifications, but also from those specialist skills that individual has developed through a sector, maybe in their home country or elsewhere in the world. It means as well that employers have access to diverse talent pools, and also as well, the hiring of international talent does increase your brand awareness as an organization internationally, as well as more control over staffing plans. And you may ask why. So just to share with you, the average length that a graduate will stay in a graduate role is usually 18 months. And if you work with a student on the graduate route, that could be up to 2 years. And if you then sponsor that individual, it's very difficult for a student to switch employers on the skilled worker route. So you have potentially a loyal confirmed member of staff for up to 5 years. So there are a lot of advantages about hiring international talent as well. We know that our students, they do have barriers. Some of them are actual barriers, some of them are perceived barriers. So for instance, language barriers. And in many cases, the language barrier is perceived rather than an actual issue, because the student, in order to successfully gain access to higher education in the UK, needs to meet minimum language requirements. But many students, for confidence reasons, may struggle with confidence in speaking in another language. There are misconceptions that exist in how to access graduate employment for these students, because it differs in other countries. The UK is quite unique in how we operate at graduate and student level. So in many other countries, placements is what it says. Many institutions overseas will place the student into an organization. So an organization would come to the university and say, we have 10 placement positions within the organization. And that career service would then place the 10 students based on the needs of the employer, much like a recruitment agency type relationship. Equally, internships operate differently outside the UK. So in many countries, internships are available to students throughout their degree, not just aimed at second years or penultimate year students, but also they're available to students after they graduate. So many employers have graduate internships overseas that students can access in order to gain skills and experiences. Our student expectations versus employer expectations, that can differ from time to time. And I think by partnering with our employers closer and working together, we can understand what those differences are and help manage the student expectations, but also help to work with employers on how we can work more effectively with these students. Our international students also have a very high expectations and input, depending on where they are from the world, in the world, from parents. So some students will have career aspirations because that's their family expectations. And sometimes when we're asking careers questions, such as, why this career? We have to accept the cultural nuances that come with that a family expectation of someone progressing into a career in accountancy and finance is as good a reason as somebody who is passionate about accountancy and finance, and not minimizing that from a Western capacity. So thinking about our own perceptions and how we might be imposing them on others. So if a student is pursuing a career because the family has decided along with that student that this is the best thing for them and their future, how do we perceive that as potential employers, and also as higher education professionals? How do we support the student through that? And students engaging with events, activities, and experiences during study, you know, accessing those activities, because these students have been educated from a young age to prioritize academic studies. So sometimes it can be difficult to engage these students in what they consider to be extracurricular activities, because that's what they've been taught. So recruiter talks and fairs may be seen as extracurricular. So how we as higher education professionals educate our students more and help them to understand about that balancing of careers alongside their academic studies. Visas is a barrier, and it is difficult because not all employers are following the visa system in a way that is accessible for students. So for instance, again, I said it before, employers may not know a lot about visas, but sometimes the student hasn't done the relevant research either on what visa options they have after study. So it can be quite intimidating and overwhelming. But when an employer says in any adverts that they don't sponsor visas, that can be quite disheartening for students, and also, you know, it does contravene HR legislation. So we know that we can't discriminate against an applicant based on their country of origin. So although, you know, applicants need to meet right to work checks, we have to be careful about how we advertise and the wording that we use. And then EDI, I know I've touched on employer expectations, but again, that comes back to the cultural nuances, it comes back to communication, it comes back to employment processes are very westernized, and how do we account for, you know, we're looking for diverse talent. We know diverse talent in the workplace increases profitability for organizations, but how are we managing that in terms of employer engagement with students? And how are employers engaging? We you know, the students need to have that level of cultural awareness and be able to operate in the UK. But equally, if we want to be a global community, how can we update our thinking, our information on working cross-culturally? And I did talk about EDI. So it is really important because a lot of these international students will see that EDI is a very trending topic right now. A lot of companies are citing their EDI policies, their dynamic policies in the job adverts now. But yeah, you will see at the very end, we do not sponsor or we do not hire from the graduate route, which really does feel like a contradiction. So how can we work together to circumnavigate this and work together to make our policies transparent but inclusive? So this is just, you know, thinking about what are your thoughts when you hear these questions. So this is some of the feedback that I've had from employers in the past based on these questions. So can I work in the UK? So a student comes to an event or a fair or a talk, and they come up to the recruiter at the end of that talk and they say, you know, can I work in the UK? When can I start working in the UK? Do you sponsor visas? And the feedback I've gotten in the past from employers is, oh, they just want a visa. But no, it's a valid question, because application processes for a lot of organizations now are quite intensive and can take quite a lot of time. So these students are looking at, how can I work more efficiently and effectively? If this employer isn't going to consider me, then I need to move on and think about who will. And it's not a case of I'm going to work for anyone who can offer me a visa, because that is the perpetual myth that exists. A lot of these students are looking at, similarly to UK students, it informs their career decision making. So do I want to work for an employer who is inclusive? Do I want to work for an employer who does have equitable and equal opportunities for all? Do I want to work for an employer who has a very good standard of best practice for hiring diverse talent? So thinking about what are your assumptions when you hear these questions? How, do we want to help these students? How do we want to diversify our workforce? Do we want to create leaders of the future? But equally, the latest question that has been coming up more and more from our students, and we're hearing across the UK from different colleagues, is why does my university work with employers who discriminate against me? And that's a really disheartening question, and it is becoming more common. And the reason it's becoming more common is because the We Are International campaign has been relaunched and it's really getting traction. But also our international students are becoming more educated on their rights. They're becoming more educated on the HR legislation in the UK. And universities who continue to work with employers who may not be up to date but are not doing anything to correct that, we're being lumped in here. So it's how can we work effectively with employers to make sure that we are creating best practice, that we are creating opportunities for students. Employer engagement teams, you have one of the more difficult roles because you're managing expectations, not just student expectations and employer expectations, but also colleague expectations. So those colleagues who are working in a face-to-face capacity with students, you're having to manage their expectations of all the different nuances that you have to meet in terms of targets, in terms of getting employers to events on campus. But equally, we have a responsibility as employer engagement teams to close those knowledge gaps for employers and educate our employer partners in how to be better, but also how to be supported, because we know not all employers have access to the expertise or the funds to access expertise. And we want to make sure that we help our employer partners to do that. And navigate through those cultural nuances. There's always learning to do. Every day for me is a school day. So, there's always something to learn about cultural nuances and how can I work better to make my students feel represented, but also to help employers navigate those difficult conversations or to get the best out of their potential candidates or future graduates. Managing employer-led events as well, looking at our employer-led events and how we can work with employers to make sure that they're marketing events in an accessible way, that they're communicating effectively with our students, that again, demonstrating best practice, and that those relationships with employers are leading to positive impact on university reputation. We know that as institutions, we have increasing pressures on student numbers, and we know that many institutions across the UK have quite high targets for recruiting international students. So we are balancing various different priorities within the higher education sector. But can we work together as employer engagement teams to support one another and be more transparent in our own teams and with our employers, and working for the best interests of our students and graduates? So we know that employer conversations, they're evolving. So we know with large graduate recruiters, many graduate schemes or graduate programs are designed to last more than 2 years. There is a lack of transparency over which graduate schemes are open to international students and which ones aren't. And we know as well that there can be time lags in graduates receiving the graduate visa. So what can we do, thinking about strategies, working with our employers, what can we do to improve these areas with our larger graduate recruiters? And also for those of you who work for large graduate recruiters, how can you work with our colleagues in employer engagement to, make these opportunities more accessible and increase transparency and work in a way that is going to benefit the entire university and student communities, and also will get you the best talent, because ultimately that's what we want to help our employers do, is access the best talent. But that best talent could be anyone from anywhere. So, you know, why risk missing out on fantastic opportunities? Because I'm not saying it's all about international students, but what I'm saying is there's a large proportion of the student community missing out. Equally, as employers, you may also be missing out because you're not really accessing the entire student community. And for those small to medium enterprises, you know, the lack of awareness around the graduate visa route, how can we work with our employers to help them to navigate this and you know, have those conversations to help them understand what that red tape and expense may be. And not always aware of benefits of recruiting international students, or how we can highlight those benefits. And I'm going to share resources that will benefit both our employers who are here on the call, but also our higher education colleagues. So thinking about the first steps in developing your international talent, for those of you who are employers, it's working closely with your university career services to develop best practice. It can be quite, if you've got a few relationships with a few different universities, it can be overwhelming, especially at your pinch points in the year. But opening up communications with your career services to have conversations, to have catch-up calls, to really develop good, strong relationships, not posting on platforms as an anonymous employer, but really having conversations and connecting with your employer engagement team can really help you to understand what other employers are doing that you could benefit from. And close those knowledge gaps by accessing information, which I'll share with you through QR codes. So if you've got your phone ready and a QR reader, I've given you advance notice. I've got some QR codes. I will be sharing these slides. I've sent them to Chris already, so Chris has them if he wants to share them. So there will be links as well, but the QR codes are there for you to access the information. And develop in-house training on cultural nuances in the workplace, getting either colleagues from training and development in to look at how we can improve communication, understanding of cultural nuances to make a more effective workplace, and upskilling student graduate facing staff and engaging with international student questions. So many of the, you know, early careers recruitment staff and do sometimes have difficulty answering the questions around visas, and sometimes just say we don't sponsor because it's an easy question or an easy answer, sorry, to give to the question. And again, because it's intimidating. Visas are complicated. They can be, I say they're complicated, they can be complicated, but we really should be looking at upskilling staff around what the visa options are. And there really are two main routes, which is the graduate visa route and the skilled worker route. And the more you know, and the more your student-facing staff know, and the more employer engagement knows, and the more we know as careers staff in general, careers advisors and consultants, the better the experience for all students will be. So you can have confident conversations at fairs and recruitment events as recruiters with students. And that again can help you to think about EDI in its truer context, you know, the bigger picture. EDI, not just British EDI, but global EDI. What does that mean for your business? What could that mean for your business? And be open to conversations and consider the reputational impact. International students are a huge proportion of our student community. We have these over 120 odd students here at Lancaster, represented here at Lancaster alone. So having that many countries represented, you know, it just adds to the community, it adds to the region. What could that do for your business? And access help and advice on government policy and HR legislation. Make sure that the decisions and the adverts and the marketing that you're putting out there does meet those requirements. But if you're unsure, you know, as higher education institutions, we are always open to working with our employers to help and check and make sure that you're supported throughout your recruitment process. So the first thing I want to share with everybody is the UKISA Employer Guide to Recruiting International Graduates. This is a fantastic guide. So this basically helps employers understand what the processes are, what your options are. It also touches on discrimination as well, so that you can avoid potentially discriminating against candidates. So that really helps you to navigate that. and it's freely available on the UKESA website. If you Google UKESA Employer Guide, it'll come up. So if you can't access the QR code, you can Google UKESA Employer Guide and that'll come up. Page 6 talks about the discrimination and that case law exists where in the past a student has taken an employer to court for discrimination. So that helps you to understand what that means and how to be, how to avoid making similar mistakes. So this is a fantastic guide, and it's something that we recommend not just to employers, but also to employer engagement teams, so that they have this on hand to help them when they're talking to employers and have a reference for information. And then also that this has been released this week. So I want to share with you that we, through Bwila, and I have been a part of this in creating some of these resources. My colleague Teresa Corcoran is also from Nottingham, has also created some of the resources through the videos. But newly launched suite of materials for you, which helps to provide guidance to employers and students on the graduate route and skilled worker route. There's some infographic material there. There's a print version and an interactive version and a digital version. So if you as employer engagement teams want to download these materials and put them on your website, employer-facing website, but as employers, you want to download these materials as well. It's open access. You don't need a login to access these materials. And they just will help you to understand the benefits of recruiting international talent, the options as a recruiter or as an employer with the two visa routes that we mentioned. We know there's more than just the two visa routes, but specifically focusing on the skilled worker route, the graduate route, helps you to understand the differences between the two different visa routes and how you can benefit engaging with talent on either route. So the videos are fantastic as well. It helps to give you more context on benefits, the cost and convenience of the skilled worker route, dispelling any of those myths around hiring of international talent. And then also the last thing that I mentioned at the very start, the research that we did. So for those of you who are interested in the research that AGCAS conducted, we conducted this research last year. There are some great case studies as well that are on the AGCAS website for you to use in materials, but basically highlights the experience of international graduates seeking UK employment. It gives it that voice, it humanizes the experience, because I know with the negative rhetoric that's out there, it can be quite one-sided, and has some great recommendations at the very end. For those of you who just want to scan to the end, the recommendations are for policymakers, employers, universities and career staff as well. And it was funded by the UPP Foundation and endorsed by UKESA, UKI and Bwila. So I'm going to end it there and take any questions, but I know that was a whistle-stop tour, and I could talk about this, as Chris knows, and I have talked Chris's ear off, but I could talk about this for a lot longer, but just to give you time for some questions.
Brilliant, Noeline. Thanks so much. Yeah, really pleased we managed to get something like this onto the agenda, because I feel that, with all the talk of intersectionality, the international students can often get sort of forgotten. So thanks for that. Really interesting stuff. We've got some questions that we'll try to rattle through. First one just said that can we share the links after the session, please? I will make sure that every attendee, even if you haven't seen this session, will get a copy of the presentation, and then all the links will be in there. Couple of questions. So first of all, the first one that came in, you might be able to see these anyway, Noeline, but I think the issue is the cost and bureaucracy at the end of the visa is the main barrier. So the visas are only temporary, and the procedure at the end is a minefield and penalties huge. So I guess not a question as such, but probably something that you've heard before, Noeline, in a similar way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those myths that gets perpetuated. So there is a cost, but then if you think about the long-term cost benefit analysis, if you're hiring someone who you know is going to be in your organization for 5 years versus potentially the cost of recruitment of somebody into a position 3 times in that period. If you're looking at an 18-month average, it can be actually more beneficial to the organization. It's not a minefield. The new points-based immigration system through the skilled worker visa has actually been made much more straightforward and simpler for employers to engage with. And the penalties are actually more so, you're more so at risk of a penalty if you're found to be discriminating against an international candidate. So the HR legislation at the moment does say that you can't discriminate against the country of origin, but if you don't have a valid reason or an exemption for hiring international talent, even if you don't have a sponsor license, you can get a sponsor license. So you do risk being fined by the Home Office if you're reported for breaching the legislation. So it's important for employers to really look at, actually, here's the materials that we're sharing today, and the materials that were launched this week, they were launched yesterday. So brand new, just in time for the conference, will actually help to break down this idea of bureaucracy and complicated language. It makes it much more accessible and clearly breaks down the cost for employers.
Thanks, Nolene. Next one, we have, how can we address concerns about fostering inclusivity when we are aware that international students might encounter challenges in obtaining the required security clearance for certain graduate roles?
So the only exemption that exists for not sponsoring a graduate is national security. So if a student, for national security reasons, you cannot hire a student for national security reasons into an organization. So you're looking at some organizations such as GCHQ, or if it's to do with the government. Outside of that, what do you mean by security clearance? So again, you've got to be careful and really do your research to see what you mean. So I had a company come to me not so long ago who were Canadian based, but were doing consulting for UK, and they cited security clearance as an issue. But actually, if your staff are already located in Canada, there isn't the exemption there. So you have to be very careful. Look at the exemptions, which usually relate to salary. So if the salary threshold isn't met, if you are a charity offering certain positions, and then also national security. So it's if there are exemptions there and your roles meet those exemptions, then you have a legal standpoint that you cannot sponsor in that instance. But I would investigate that, make sure that you do.
Thanks, Nolene. Next one, this is really interesting. We have a structured program, but no assigned roles at the end of a program. This is more a bit of a statement again, as they obtain roles through their networking throughout the 2 years. It does come down to cost for the site and also some of the hurdles we need to overcome going through the application processes.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, costs to the Home Office, yeah, it can be costly, but if for whatever reason you're saying that you can't sponsor because of cost, but yet you don't fall into the exemption categories, then you might risk being fined. So it's one of those where it's like you've got to get that balance. And skilled worker route, as I said, is more accessible for employers. It's not tier 2. Tier 2 was different. It was more difficult to get. But the materials that I've shared today hopefully will break down those myths, those misconceptions, and make costs a bit clearer.
Brilliant. I'm going to get to this training one. I think it's quite interesting. Mike says, can you signpost us to some training specifically for this so a person can be upskilled and competent to lead this and utilize these sorts of graduates?
So at CAS, have some great webinars. We did a series of webinars earlier this year, that are open access on the website that you can just access, and it's all about working with international students. And also the UKISA website is fantastic. That's a great way of being able to access information. And the employer guide, as I said, it's not a long document. It is very straightforward. It's written by ISEG. And they keep it fairly up to date. So all the information in there is up to date as of the latest immigration and visa announcements. So yeah, it's using the documents and the information that I've shared.
I'm going to have to wrap it up just for time, as I know some people are going to have meetings and stuff like that. Any questions I didn't get to, please do add Nolene on LinkedIn. I'm sure that she'll be happy to discuss. She's very much super helpful. We've had some great chats before, and I'm sure we'll have another one in the future. Thank you so much, Nolene. Really appreciate it. As always, great to chat.
Thank you, everyone.
All the best. Okay, thank you so much to everyone that attended. Really appreciate your time. If you want to get in touch about any of the sessions, drop me a message, add me on LinkedIn. We will be sharing all video recordings and all slides to all attendees, so watch out for that email. And in the meantime, have a lovely afternoon.